Bloodstains on a crisp white tablecloth usually mean the end of a career, or a life in Manhattan's underground elite dining scene. Alexei Volkov had already terrified 3 seasoned servers into quitting before the appetizers even arrived. He was a phantom, a ruthless syndicate leader who refused to speak English, watching his empire expand while demanding absolute perfection from those serving him. Fired staff whispered about his icy glare and the loaded weapons his guards openly carried. Nobody could handle Table 4. That was until Madeline Foster picked up a silver tray, walked right into the lion's den, and ordered the mafia boss to behave in flawless, unaccented Russian. Laura was not merely a restaurant. It was a fortress of culinary excellence veiled behind the heavy velvet curtains of Manhattan's Upper East Side. To secure a reservation, one needed either inherited wealth or a name that could make city officials sweat. Arthur Channing, the proprietor, had built his life around catering to both. He knew the politicians, the hedge fund managers, and the socialites. But more importantly, he knew the men who operated in the shadows, the men who paid in unmarked bills and required the private dining alcove at the back, heavily shielded from prying eyes. Tonight, the alcove belonged to Alexei Volkov. Alexei was a ghost in the international intelligence community, but in the criminal underworld he was a god. He controlled shipping lanes from St. Petersburg to the eastern seaboard of the United States. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and cold calculation, possessing eyes the color of a frozen lake. He wore bespoke suits that cost more than the average American made in a year, and he traveled with an entourage of men who looked less like security and more like an invading army. What made Alexei particularly terrifying to the staff of Laura was his absolute refusal to speak English. Whether he couldn't or simply wouldn't was a matter of intense debate in the kitchen. He communicated his displeasure through sharp, guttural commands in Russian, terrifying glares, or slight gestures of his hand that sent his heavily muscled lieutenants into action. At 7:30, the tension in the kitchen was thick enough to choke on. Arthur Channing was sweating through his Egyptian cotton shirt. "Grigory is out," Arthur hissed, pacing the gleaming stainless steel prep area. He poured the Pinot Noir. Alexei looked at him, muttered something, and Yuri, the bodyguard with the scar across his throat, literally placed a hand over Gregory's wrist and squeezed until the bottle cracked. "Gregory is in the locker room hyperventilating. Send Chloe," the head chef suggested without looking up from his station. "Chloe went out there 5 minutes ago with the bread service," Arthur replied, his voice rising in panic. Alexei snapped at her in Russian, and she froze. She tried to ask him to repeat himself in French, thinking he was European. He just laughed, a cold, dead laugh. Then he waved her away like a stray dog. "I need someone out there who won't crumble. If we offend him, he doesn't just leave a bad Yelp review. He buys the building and burns it down." In the corner of the kitchen, meticulously polishing a crystal water goblet, stood Madeline Foster. Madeline was 24, unassuming, and fiercely private. She wore her dark hair pulled back into a severe bun, and her uniform was always immaculately pressed. She was not the most glamorous server at Laura, nor was she the most extroverted, but she was flawlessly efficient. She had been working there for 6 months, keeping her head down, collecting her substantial tips, and never participating in the post-shift gossip. No one knew much about her, only that she lived in Queens and took the subway home alone every night. "Madeline," Arthur said, his eyes darting toward her with sudden, desperate hope. "You're up." Madeline carefully set the crystal goblet down. "I'm assigned to the terrace tonight, Mr. Channing." "The terrace is fine. They can wait." "Table 4 cannot wait. You have the highest composure of anyone on my staff. You don't flinch. Just go out there, pour the water, smile. Do not make eye contact with the boss. If he speaks, Just nod and back away slowly. Can you do that? Madeline looked toward the swinging doors that led to the dining room. She needed this job. The debts her father had left behind was suffocating, a ticking clock of financial ruin hanging over her head. She couldn't afford to be fired because Arthur Channing was too cowardly to manage his own VIPs. I'll take care of it, Madeline said softly. She picked up a fresh silver tray, loaded it with a bottle of chilled sparkling water and a pristine white cloth, and pushed through the doors. The atmosphere in the main dining room was filled with the low hum of expensive conversations and the clinking of fine silver. But as Madeline approached the back alcove, the air grew noticeably colder. The transition was palpable. Alexei Volkov sat at the head of the heavy oak table, flanked by two immense men. Yuri, the one with the scar, stood near the wall, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Another man, Ivan, sat to Alexei's right, casually inspecting a diamond-encrusted watch. Alexei himself was staring at a dossier on the table, his face an unreadable mask. He exuded an aura of absolute authority. He didn't just occupy the room, he owned the oxygen in it. Madeline approached silently. She stepped to Alexei's right, keeping her movements fluid and predictable. She uncapped the sparkling water, wrapped the bottle in the white linen, and reached out to pour. As the first drop of water hit the ice in his glass, Alexei didn't look up from his papers. He simply waved his hand dismissively and spat a harsh command in his native tongue. Ubirejcie, ne nenushna taiwaya pomoshte. Prinesi man vodku, inasze vizu apravriayushiko. Get out. I don't need your help. Bring me vodka, or I will see the manager. Yuri stepped forward, his massive hand reaching out to grab Madeline's shoulder to physically remove her from the table, just as he had done to the others. Madeline did not flinch. She did not drop the bottle. She did not back away. Instead, she smoothly stepped out of Yuri's reach, placed the bottle firmly on the table, and looked directly into Alexei Volkov's frozen eyes. Silence slammed into the alcove. Yuri froze, his hand suspended in midair, stunned by the sheer audacity of the server stepping away from him. Ivan stopped looking at his watch. Alexei slowly raised his head. His gaze was lethal, a silent promise of violence for this breach of protocol. He looked at Madeline as if she were an insect that had just crawled onto his plate. Madeline held his gaze. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but years of surviving a chaotic childhood had taught her how to build an impenetrable wall over her emotions. She stood tall, her posture perfect. Then she opened her mouth and the temperature in the room plummeted further. Vodka которую здесь подают, оформлена для американских туристов, господин Volkov, Madeline said. Her voice was calm, melodic, and pitched perfectly to cut through the heavy silence. Her pronunciation was flawless, carrying the refined, aristocratic accent of the Moscow elite, accent rarely heard in the grim circles of the Bratva. The vodka served here is meant for American tourists, Mr. Volkov. Alexei's eyes widened by a fraction of a millimeter. It was the only sign of his profound shock. Madeline didn't stop. U nas jest zapas beluga epicure v podvale. Menega praše jego potomochal. On slishkom truthlive, choti predlosiet jego. Jestli vizelete, ja mogu prinesti jego, a takshishanuju ekru, kotoruju, kakya vizu, viesce nezakazali. We have a reserve of Beluga epicure in the cellar. The manager hides it because he is too cowardly to offer it. If you wish, I can bring it, along with the black caviar I see you haven't ordered yet. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one breathed. Yuri looked at Alexei, waiting for the command to drag this insolent woman out to the alley. Then, a low, rumbling sound began in Alexei's chest. It took a moment for Madeline to realize it was laughter. It was dark, genuine amusement. Alexei leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. He studied her, truly looking at her for the first time. He took in her cheap uniform, her tight bun, and the defiant fire burning behind her dark eyes. "Odkud ty, devochka?" he asked, his voice a gravelly baritone that sent a shiver down Madeline's spine. Where are you from, girl?" "Я родилась в Chicago," Madeline lied smoothly. "I was born in Chicago." Alexei smirked, a dangerous, knowing expression. "Tvoy akcent govorit o drugom. Etai akcent starik denek. Akcent lidei, kotorai dumayut. Toto oni luchinas." "Your accent says otherwise. It is the accent of old money. The accent of people who think they are better than us." "My mother was very particular about my education," Madeline replied, switching to English to prove a point. She believed that if you are going to speak a language, you should speak it correctly, regardless of who you are speaking to. The subtle insult was not lost on him. Alexei's smile faded into an expression of intense, dangerous intrigue. "Bring the beluga," Alexei commanded in perfect, heavy-accented English. "And bring 2 glasses." Madeline nodded once, perfectly professional. "Right away, sir." She turned and walked out of the alcove, feeling the heavy weight of his stare drilling into her spine until she pushed through the kitchen doors. The moment she was safely in the kitchen, her knees buckled slightly. She caught herself on a prep counter, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "What happened?" Arthur Channing demanded, rushing over, his face pale. "I saw Yuri move. Did they touch you?" "Do I need to call security?" "Oh God, I have to call the mayor." "Mr. Channing," Madeline interrupted, her voice steadying. "I need the key to the private cellar. Mr. Permont Volkov has requested the beluga epicure." Arthur stared at her as if she had just grown a second head. He requested the epicure? He didn't speak to you in English, and you don't speak Russian." "I do, actually," Madeline said, holding out her hand for the key. "And he requested it. He also wants black caviar. The good stuff, not the domestic." Arthur fumbled in his pocket, producing a heavy brass key. "Madeline, what did you say to him?" "I just took his order," she lied. When Madeline returned to the alcove 10 minutes later, the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer just a server, she was an anomaly. An enigma that Alexei Volkov was determined to solve. She poured the exquisite vodka into 2 chilled crystal glasses. She set one in front of Alexei, and to her surprise he pushed the second glass toward her. "Drink," he ordered. "I am on duty, sir." "It is strictly against policy." Alexei did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I am the policy in this room. Drink." Madeline looked at the glass. She knew the rules of this world better than Arthur Channing ever could. To refuse a drink from a man like Alexei was a profound insult. It was a test of trust. She picked up the glass. "Bashez Dordovi," she murmured, offering the traditional toast. "To your health." She drank it like water, the liquid fire burning a path down her throat, but she didn't so much as blink. She placed the empty glass softly on the table. "Good," Alexei murmured. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit." "Mr. Volkov, I have other tables. I have bought the restaurant for the night," Alexei interrupted calmly. "Arthur will be compensated. You are my server now." "Sit." Madeline slowly pulled out the heavy oak chair and sat across from the most dangerous man in New York. "You are hiding," Alexei stated, leaning forward, the scent of expensive cologne and danger washing over her. "A woman who speaks the language of the oligarchs, serving food to fat politicians." "Why?" "But I'm paying rent," Madeline deflected. "New York is expensive." "Do not lie to me, Madeline," he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded like a threat wrapped in velvet. Lying to me is a very bad habit to form. I can find out everything about you with one phone call. I prefer you tell me the truth. Before Madeline could formulate a response that wouldn't expose her dangerous past, the heavy velvet curtains at the entrance of the alcove were thrown open. A new group of men entered. At the center was Declan Murphy. Declan Murphy was a stark contrast to Alex's refined brutality. Declan was a product of Hell's Kitchen, a bruiser who had clawed his way to the top of the Irish syndicate with brass knuckles and a terrifying temper. He wore a rumpled suit, his face flushed, and a thick scar bisected his left eyebrow. He smelled of cheap cigars and stale whiskey. Behind Declan stood three men who looked like they broke legs for a hobby. The air in the alcove instantly turned toxic. The two syndicates had been engaged in a shadow war over the Brooklyn docklands for 6 months. Tonight was supposed to be a peace summit. Declan swaggered to the table, eyeing Madeline with blatant disrespect. Nice of you to throw a party, Volkov. Didn't know you had a taste for the help. Get her out of here. We have business. Yuri's hand dropped toward his jacket, where the heavy bulge of a firearm rested. Alexei didn't blink. He raised a single finger, and Yuri halted. She stays, Alexei said in English, his accent thick but his tone leaving no room for argument. She will translate. Declan scoffed, pulling out a chair and slumping into it. Translate. I brought my own guy. He gestured to a weasel-faced man, hovering near the back of his group. I do not trust your guy, Alexei replied coldly. He speaks Russian like a dying goat. Madeline stays. She speaks. Perfectly. Madeline's heart hammered against her ribs. She was trapped. She had tried to stay invisible in this city, tried to outrun the ghosts of her family's past, and now she was sitting at ground zero of a mafia war. Fine, Declan spat. Let's get this over with. Tell this arrogant bastard, Declan looked at Madeline, pointing a thick finger at Alexei, that the docks south of Pier 40 belong to me. My grandfather bled on those docks. He's moving his shipping containers into my territory, and I want him out by Friday. Or I start burning his ships. Madeline swallowed hard. She turned to Alexei. She couldn't translate that verbatim. It would trigger an immediate shootout. She had to soften the blow while conveying the message. Gospodin Murphy, utvercztajet. Tajeł już nie doki odleuciajugo. Historiczeskoj teretarisheskoj. Madeline said smoothly in Russian. On Trebiat forbivajuveli svoje korabli do payatnici, inače on ugrožajet primenit nasililai. Mr. Murphy claims the southern docks are his historical territory. He demands you move your ships by Friday, or he threatens violence. Alexei let out a soft, mocking chuckle. He leaned back, steepled his fingers and spoke directly to Madeline, ignoring Declan entirely. Skazi tomu irkomu chrestianinu. To jego deadbile pianici, kotorai uma wikanave. Doki prenidalesh tomu, u kogo jest flast aikuderstaat. Jesli on kosnetia kotia, by odnogo izmoj kontenerov, jesteleju tak. To jego semja ishiznet. Nakinaya, jego manachego brata. Tell this Irish peasant that his grandfather was a drunk who died in a ditch. The docks belong to whoever has the power to hold them. If he touches even one of my containers, I will make his family disappear. Starting with his little brother, Madeline felt the color drain from her face. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a declaration of war. She turned to Declan. She had to navigate this tightrope perfectly. Mr. Volkov respectfully disagrees with your historical claim, Madeline translated, keeping her voice incredibly steady. He believes ownership is dictated by current operational capacity. He also strongly advises against damaging his property, as the retaliation would be severe and targeted at your immediate family. Declan slammed his fists on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. Respectfully disagrees. You tell him I don't give a damn about his operations. He thinks he's untouchable because he's got money from back home. He's nothing here. The shouting continued for 20 agonizing minutes. Madeline sat in the crossfire, acting as a linguistic shield, softening Alexei's lethal threats and filtering Declan's crude insults. She realized quickly that Alexei understood every word Declan was saying in English. He was using Madeline to buy time, to study Declan's reactions, and to assert his dominance by refusing to speak Declan's language. Finally, Declan, red-faced and panting, leaned across the table. "You think you hold all the cards, Volkov?" Declan sneered. "I know about your money laundering operation through the offshore accounts. I know who set it up for you 3 years ago before he went into hiding. A rat named Jonathan Foster. We've been tracking him. And when I find him, I'm going to carve him up and send you the pieces to prove you can be touched." Oh, the world tilted on its axis. The heavy oak table, the gleaming crystal, the expensive suits, everything blurred around the edges. Jonathan Foster. Madeline's breathing stopped. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her skirt under the table so hard her nails drew blood from her palms. Her father, the man who had ruined their lives, dragged them through the mud of international criminal finance, and then vanished, leaving her to deal with the fallout and the debts. She had changed her name. She had hidden. But she hadn't hidden well enough. A micro-expression of pure, unadulterated terror flashed across Madeline's face. It was there and gone in less than a second, but Alexei Volkov missed nothing. He didn't look at Declan. He looked sharply at Madeline. He saw the sudden paleness of her skin, the slight tremor in her hands that she was desperately trying to conceal. He saw the ghost behind her eyes. "Perevedi," Alexei commanded softly in Russian, his eyes locked onto hers like a predator spotting a wounded deer. "Translate." Madeline opened her mouth, but her throat was completely dry. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. If she translated that, Alexei would know. He would look into her eyes and he would connect the dots. "Yeah," Madeline started, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat, forcing the wall back up, forcing the terror down. "On Govorit, on Zineyet of Vashik, of Shonik Shita, on Isha Cheluvaka, Kodorie Sostele, Dozonatana Fostara, on Planaruyet Ubit Iego, Tobi Poslat Vam Sobshini," he says. "He knows about your offshore accounts. He is looking for the man who set them up, Jonathan Foster. He plans to kill him to send you a message." Alexei leaned in closer to Madeline. He ignored Declan entirely. "A pokemiu, moja dorogaya Madeline, imya mojego bivshego bukultara zastavilo divoi ruki drozhat." Alexei asked, his voice a lethal whisper intended only for her. "And why, my dear Madeline, did the name of my former accountant make your hands shake?" Madeline felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. She had just walked into the lion's den, and the door had firmly locked behind her. The silence in the alcove was sudden and absolute, ringing in Madeline's ears louder than Declan Murphy's shouting. Declan, oblivious to the silent, lethal exchange happening across the table, took Madeline's hesitation as a victory. He stood up, buttoning his rumpled suit jacket with a smug grin. "You think on that, Volkov," Declan sneered, tossing a crushed cigar onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Friday, or the East River is going to run red with your crew." He didn't wait for a translation. Declan and his bruisers turned and pushed their way through the velvet curtains, leaving behind the acrid scent of stale tobacco and impending war. The moment the curtains swung shut, Alexei's demeanor shifted. The cold, unreadable mask he wore for the Irishman vanished, replaced by the terrifying focus of an apex predator that had just cornered its prey. He raised a single hand. Yuri and Ivan immediately stepped back, taking positions by the entrance, effectively barricading the room. Madeleine was tracked. Jonathan Foster. Alexei repeated the name in English, testing the syllables on his tongue. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his icy blue eyes pinning her to a chair. A brilliant man with numbers. A very stupid man with loyalties. He skimmed $4 million from my accounts and vanished with the decryption keys to my offshore ledgers. And now I find a waitress working in a high-end restaurant, speaking flawless Moscow elite Russian, whose hands shake at the mention of his name. Madeleine forced her breathing to slow. Panic would get her killed. She had spent the last 3 years outrunning her father's ghosts. She wasn't going to die in the back room of Laura. I don't know what you're talking about, Madeleine lied smoothly, keeping her voice level. My hands shook because Mr. Murphy threatened violence. I am just a server, Mr. Volkov. Alexei smiled. It was a terrifying expression. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a sleek black smartphone. He tapped the screen twice and slid it across the table toward her. On the screen was a scanned copy of a birth certificate. Madeleine Grace Foster, father Jonathan Edward Foster, mother Catherine Claire Foster. You see, Madeleine, Alexei said softly, his voice a low rumble. I do not believe in coincidences. I believe in leverage. When Jonathan disappeared, I had my associates, Harrison and Lawson, tear apart his life. We knew he had a daughter who attended the University of Chicago, majoring in forensic accounting, who suddenly dropped out and vanished the exact same week her father did. Madeleine stared at the screen. The meticulous, invisible life she had built in Queens, the cash-only rent, the burner phones, it had all unraveled in a span of 20 minutes. He left me nothing, Madeleine said, dropping the polite server persona entirely. Her voice hardened, matching the coldness in the room. If you're looking for your $4 million, you're interrogating the wrong person. He left me with $2 million in debt to a cartel out of Miami. I've spent 3 years waiting tables and running underground books just to keep them from breaking my legs. I haven't seen him since the night he ran. Alexei watched her carefully. He was a human lie detector, trained in the brutal interrogation rooms of his youth. He saw the genuine bitterness in her eyes, the exhaustion of a woman who had been running for too long. I do not care about the $4 million, Alexei dismissed with a wave of his hand. It is pocket change. I care about the ledger. The decryption keys he took contained the routing numbers for a global syndicate network. If Declan Murphy or the feds get their hands on it, my entire operation goes dark. He reached out and picked up the crystal glass of vodka, swirling it slowly. You are going to find him for me, Madeleine. I told you I don't know where he is, she fired back. If I did, I would have dragged him back to Miami myself to pay off his own debts. You do not know his physical location, perhaps, Alexei countered. But you know his mind. You are his blood. You know his patterns, his aliases, his fallback protocols. He taught you forensic accounting. He trained you. And now you would use that training for me. And if I refuse? Alexei finished his vodka and set the glass down with a sharp clink. Then I open those curtains and I tell Declan Murphy exactly who you are. The Irish will not be as conversational as I am. They will take you to a warehouse in Queens, and they will peel your skin off inch by inch, broadcasting it on the dark web, until your father comes out of hiding to save you. A cold sweat broke out across the back of Madeleine's neck. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. Declan Murphy was a butcher. If I help you, Madeleine negotiated, her survival instincts overriding her terror. If I find the ledger, You clear my debt with the Miami cartel. You pay them off, and you let me walk away, completely clean." Alexei's eyes gleamed with dark amusement. He admired her audacity. Most men would be begging for their lives. This waitress was negotiating contract terms. "Deal," Alexei agreed smoothly. "But understand this, Madeline. You are no longer a waitress. You belong to me until the ledger is in my hands. If you run, I will hunt you. If you lie to me, I will kill you myself. Do we have an understanding?" Madeline looked at the man who had just taken ownership of her life. She nodded once. "We have an understanding." "Good." Alexei stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Yuri, escort Miss Foster to the car. She is checking out early." The transition from the hushed elegance of Laura to the brutal reality of Alexei Volkov's world happened in a matter of seconds. Arthur Channing was standing near the kitchen doors, wringing his hands as Alexei and his entourage emerged from the alcove. When Arthur saw Madeline walking in the center of the formation, flanked by Yuri and Ivan, his jaw dropped. "Mr. Volkov," Arthur stammered, stepping forward. "Is there a problem with the service? Madeline is." Alexei didn't even look at the restaurant owner. He pulled a thick money clip from his pocket, peeled off a stack of $100 bills that easily equaled $5,000, and dropped it into a nearby soup tureen. "She has resigned," Alexei stated coldly. They pushed through the heavy oak doors of the restaurant out onto the humid Manhattan street. A fleet of 3 black armored SUVs was idling at the curb. The valet, a young kid named Sullivan, was standing nervously by the lead car. "Get in the center vehicle," Alexei ordered Madeline, pointing to the heavily modified Escalade. Madeline stepped off the curb. The heavy humidity of the New York night clung to her skin. She reached for the door handle. That was when the first gunshot rang out. It wasn't a pistol. It was the deafening, rhythmic tear of an automatic rifle. The sound shattered the tranquil Upper East Side street. The ballet's podium exploded into splinters. "Down!" Alexei roared. Before Madeline could process the danger, a massive weight slammed into her from the side. Alexei tackled her to the pavement, pinning her behind the reinforced steel wheel of the Escalade just as a hail of bullets shattered the restaurant's front windows. Glass rained down on them like deadly snow. "Na zemlyu. Ogo na porashenie," Yuri bellowed in Russian. "Get down. Fire at will." Madeline gasped for air, her cheek pressed against the rough, dirty asphalt. The world had erupted into chaos. She could hear the deafening roar of Yuri and Ivan returning fire with heavy-caliber weapons. Screams echoed from the pedestrians further down the block. Alexei was covering her body with his own. He was completely still, his breathing measured and calm despite the war zone erupting around them. He pulled a compact Sig Sauer from his shoulder holster. "Stay exactly here," Alexei commanded in her ear, his voice slicing through the ringing in her head. He rolled off her, using the SUV's chassis for cover, and fired 3 precise shots into the dark. A screech of tires followed as a dark gray sedan riddled with bullet holes violently accelerated down the avenue, blowing through a red light to escape. The gunfire ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the sound of car alarms and shattered glass settling on the concrete. "Status," Alexei barked, standing up and pulling Madeline to her feet by the collar of her uniform. Ivan took a graze to the shoulder. "We hit their driver," Yuri reported, his eyes scanning the rooftops. It was the Irish, Murphy's men. They must have waited down the block. Madeline was trembling uncontrollably now. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving her nauseous. She looked down and saw blood pooling near her black work shoes. "You're bleeding," she choked out, pointing to Alexei's left arm. A piece of shrapnel from the valet podium had sliced through the expensive fabric of his suit jacket, leaving a deep gash near his bicep. Dark blood was soaking through the dark wool. Alexei glanced at it dismissively. "It is nothing. Get in the car." Now, they piled into the armored Escalade. Yuri took the wheel, peeling away from the curb before the doors were even fully shut, leaving the chaos and the approaching sirens of the NYPD behind. Inside the cavernous back seat, the tension was suffocating. Alexei leaned his head back against the leather headrest, his face pale but expressionless. The blood was flowing more freely now, dripping onto the pristine floor mats. Madeleine watched him. She should have been terrified of him. He had just kidnapped her. But as she watched the blood pulse from his arm, a different instinct took over, the instinct to survive and to prove herself indispensable. She reached under the seat and pulled out the vehicle's heavy emergency trauma kit. "What are you doing?" Alexei snapped as she unzipped it. "If you bleed out in the back of this SUV, the Irish win, and the cartel finds me tomorrow," Madeleine said, her voice surprisingly steady. She pulled out a pair of shears, gauze, and a bottle of antiseptic. "Take off the jacket." Alexei stared at her. The defiance in her eyes was back, burning brighter than before. Slowly, painfully, he shrugged off the ruined suit jacket and rolled up the blood-soaked sleeve of his dress shirt. Madeleine moved closer. She didn't hesitate. She poured the antiseptic directly over the wound. Alexei's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering in his cheek, but he made no sound. "My father didn't just teach me forensic accounting," Madeleine murmured, as she began to expertly pack the wound with gauze, her hands moving with clinical precision. "When you launder money for dangerous men, you learn how to handle the fallout when deals go bad. I spent my teenage years patching up his clients in our basement." She wrapped the pressure bandage tight, tying it off with a sharp pull that made Alexei hiss through his teeth. "There," she said, sitting back and wiping blood from her hands with a sterile wipe. "That will hold until you get to your private doctor." Alexei looked down at the perfectly applied bandage, then up at the woman sitting across from him. Her cheap waitress uniform was torn and stained with street dirt. Her hair had fallen out of its severe bun, framing her face in dark, messy waves. She looked completely out of place in the back of his armored car, yet completely in her element amidst the blood and violence. For the first time in his ruthless, calculated life, Alexei Volkov felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with power or money. It was a dangerous, intoxicating fascination. "You are full of surprises, Madeleine Foster," Alexei said softly, his blue eyes dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "And full of survival instincts, Mr. Volkov," she corrected him. "Alexei," he corrected her back. The use of his first name was a privilege few earned and fewer survived. "If you are going to bleed with me, you will call me Alexei." The SUV descended into an underground parking garage beneath a towering, glass-fronted skyscraper in the financial district. The iron gates slammed shut behind them, sealing Madeleine inside the fortress of the Volkov syndicate. She had traded one nightmare for another, but as she looked at the Russian boss sitting across from her, she realized this nightmare was going to be infinitely more complicated. The Volkov Syndicate's command center was not a damp basement in Brighton Beach. It was a sprawling $60 million penthouse occupying the entire top floor of a glass obelisk in the financial district. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoptic view of the city Alexei Volkov controlled. Madeleine was ushered into a private study lined with mahogany bookshelves and a bank of high-end encrypted servers blinking silently in the dark. Alexei, his arm freshly bandaged and stitched by a discreet private surgeon who had vanished as quickly as he arrived, poured himself a neat glass of Glenfiddich. He didn't offer her one. This was not a social call. This was an extraction of information. The servers are yours, Alexei said, gesturing with his glass toward a massive, curved monitor on a steel desk. I need the decryption keys to the Cayman National Corporation accounts. My money is currently paralyzed. Madeline sat down at the desk. The leather chair was still warm from whoever had been desperately failing to crack the code before she arrived. She cracked her knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room. My father was paranoid, Madeline began, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard, bringing the terminal to life. He didn't trust cloud storage, and he certainly didn't trust physical hard drives that could be seized by the FBI. He hid things in plain sight. He hid data inside other data. Alexei stood behind her, his sheer size casting a shadow over the desk. He smelled of antiseptic, expensive wool and gunpowder. Steganography? Exactly, Madeline murmured, her eyes tracking lines of code. He used to tell me that the best place to hide a dead body is in a graveyard. The best place to hide illicit financial data is inside massive, publicly available ledgers. He was obsessed with the sheer volume of global market data. For 3 hours, the only sounds in the study were the aggressive clatter of the keyboard and the distant wail of sirens far below on the Manhattan streets. Yuri stood guard outside the frosted glass door, an immovable sentinel. Alexei did not leave Madeline's side. He watched her work. He watched the severe concentration on her face, the way she bit the inside of her cheek when she hit a firewall, and the cold mechanical efficiency of her keystrokes. She was not the terrified waitress Arthur Channing thought he had hired. She was an apex predator operating in a digital jungle. Got it, Madeline suddenly whispered, leaning closer to the screen. Alexei set his blast down. The keys? No, not yet. But I found his back door, she said, pulling up a complex array of routing numbers. He hid the decryption cipher inside the daily trading volume logs of a defunct holding company listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. Brigantine Holding, LLC. But there's a problem. Alexei leaned down, his face inches from hers, his voice dangerously low. There are no problems, Madeline, only obstacles you are about to remove. Look at the access logs. She pointed to the screen, her voice tightening. Someone else has been pinging this server. Someone with a crude brute force algorithm. It's not the feds. It's too sloppy. Alexei's eyes narrowed. Murphy? Declan doesn't have the brainpower for this, Madeline countered, her mind racing. She opened a secondary terminal running a trace on the IP addresses attacking the Brigantine server. As the results cascaded down the screen, her blood ran cold. What is it? Alexei demanded, noticing the sudden rigidity of her spine. It's not Murphy trying to break in, Madeline said, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. It's my father. He's the one pinging the server. From where? From where? Madeline highlighted a cluster of IP addresses. He's bouncing the signal, but the latency is too low for it to be international. He's here. He's in New York. She turned to look at Alexei, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with terrifying clarity. He didn't just steal from you, Alexei. Look at these routing paths. He diverted 2 million of your funds into an offshore account controlled by Declan Murphy. Alexei's face became an absolute void. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. He played you both, Madeline realized aloud. He stole from the Russians to pay off the Irish, creating a war that would keep you both distracted while he vanished with the rest, and now he's trying to access the master ledger to wipe the accounts clean before Murphy or the cartel finds him. If he wipes the ledger, my syndicate loses $90 million, Alexei stated flatly. The calmness in his voice was far more terrifying than Declan's screaming. He looked down at Madeline. Can you lock him out? I can do better than that, Madeline said, a dark, unfamiliar fire burning in her chest. Jonathan Foster had ruined her life. He had abandoned her to monsters. I can trap him. I can reroute his connection and download the master ledger directly to this server. But to do it, I have to let him access the system for exactly 3 minutes. If I miss the window, he deletes everything. Alexei studied her. He was placing the entire financial foundation of his empire in the hands of a woman he had met 4 hours ago. A woman whose father had betrayed him. "Do it," Alexei commanded. Madeline's fingers danced across the keyboard. She initiated the connection, opening the digital gates. The screen flashed red as Jonathan's program infiltrated the Brigantine server. A progress bar appeared, initiating system purge. "He's deleting the files," Madeline said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Stop him," Alexei urged, his hand resting on the back of her chair. "Not yet. I need him to authenticate the decryption keys first." The progress bar reached 20%, 30%. Madeline waited, her eyes locked on a secondary window monitoring the incoming data packets. 50%. "Madeline," Alexei warned. "Wait," she hissed. 70%. Suddenly a string of complex alphanumeric characters flooded the secondary window. "The keys! Got him," Madeline shouted. She slammed her hand down on the enter key, executing a custom script she had written. The screen froze. The purge stopped at 89%. A new window popped up. "Download complete. Ledger secured." Madeline exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 years. She leaned back in the chair, pushing a stray lock of dark hair out of her eyes. "Your money is safe. I locked him out and I severed his connection. He has nothing." Alexei reached past her, his hand brushing against her shoulder, and tapped the keyboard, verifying the file sizes. It was all there. The empire was secure. He looked down at Madeline. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her exhausted, but the defiance in her eyes remained. "You did exactly what you promised," Alexei said softly. "You saved my syndicate. Now it's your turn," Madeline said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Clear my debt. Pay the Miami cartel. Let me go." Alexei walked around the desk, leaning against the edge of the mahogany table, looking down at her. "I am a man of my word, Madeline. The cartel will receive a wire transfer in 5 minutes. You are free. You have no debt. You can walk out of that door, get on the subway, and go back to a life of hiding." Madeline swallowed hard. The thought of going back to the cheap apartment, the constant paranoia, the mind-numbing labor of serving arrogant socialites, it felt physically repulsive to her now. She had tasted the power of playing at the highest stakes, and she had won. "But," Alexei continued, his voice dropping an octave, "that would be a tragic waste of your talents." "I am not a criminal," Madeline lied. "You are a survivor," Alexei corrected her. "You have the mind of an architect and the nerves of a hitman. Your father was a coward who ran from the fire. You, Madeline, you walk into it and demand a seat at the table. I do not want to let you go." Before Madeline could respond, the heavy wooden door of the study flew open. Yuri stood in the doorway, his face grim. "Boss," Yuri said in rapid Russian. "Murphy just sent a message. He found Jonathan Foster. He's holding him at Pier 40. He says if we don't bring the decryption keys in 1 hour, he puts a bullet in Foster's head and sends the remaining data to the FBI." Alexei's jaw clenched. The Irish peasant was overplaying his hand. Madeline stood up. The mention of her father's impending execution should have sent her into a panic. Instead, she felt only a cold, calculating resolve. "He doesn't have the data," Madeline said. "I wiped Jonathan's drive when I locked him out. Murphy is bluffing with an empty gun. Then we go to the pier," Alexei said, pulling a fresh magazine from his desk drawer and slamming it into his Sig Sauer. "And we show him what a loaded gun looks like." He looked at Madeline. You are free to leave, Madeline, or you can come with me and watch the men who destroyed your life burn. Madeline looked at the door leading to freedom and then at the Russian mafia boss offering her a front-row seat to vengeance. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the cheap name tag from Laura, and dropped it into the stainless steel trash can. I'm coming with you. Pier 40 was a desolate stretch of rusted shipping containers and cracked asphalt, slick with a fine freezing mist rolling off the Hudson River. The towering shadows of the container cranes looked like the skeletons of massive beasts against the sodium-lit sky. Alexei's motorcade, 3 black SUVs pulled into the center of the loading zone, their headlights cutting through the fog. They were immediately boxed in by 4 battered panel vans. Declan Murphy's men stepped out, heavily armed and twitchy. Alexei stepped out of the lead vehicle. He wore a long black cashmere overcoat, his presence demanding absolute silence from the howling wind. Yuri and Ivan flanked him, rifles held at the low ready. Madeline stepped out from the passenger side, pulling the collar of a borrowed wool coat tight around her neck. Declan Murphy stood near the edge of the pier. Kneeling in front of him, hands bound with zip ties, was an older man with graying hair and a bruised, terrified face. Jonathan Foster. Madeline felt a hollow thud in her chest, but her face remained a mask of stone. She looked at the man who had abandoned her to the wolves, feeling nothing but a profound, icy detachment. "Volkov!" Declan shouted, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel of the shipping containers. "I see you brought the help. Did you bring the drive?" "I brought the keys," Alexei lied smoothly, holding up a sleek, silver USB drive. "Let him go, Murphy. He is of no use to you now." Declan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He grabbed Jonathan by the hair, yanking his head back, and pressed the barrel of a revolver to his temple. Jonathan whimpered, his eyes darting frantically. When his gaze landed on Madeline, his eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. "Maddie?" Jonathan croaked, his voice cracking. What are you doing here?" "I am balancing your books, Father," Madeline replied, her voice cold and dead. She didn't speak in English. She spoke in flawless Russian, knowing Declan wouldn't understand, but Alexei would. Alexei smirked slightly in the darkness. "Shut up!" Declan roared, racking the hammer of the revolver. "Toss the drive, Volkov, or I scatter his brains into the river and the FBI gets a very interesting anonymous email in 5 minutes. "There is no email, Declan," Madeline said, stepping forward, ignoring Yuri's warning hand. "He has nothing. When my father tried to access the server an hour ago, I intercepted the connection. I downloaded the master ledger, and I wiped his hard drive clean. He doesn't have the Russian accounts. He doesn't even have your accounts." Declan froze. He looked down at Jonathan, who was shaking violently, unable to deny it. "You're lying," Declan spat, pointing the gun at Madeline. "I don't lie about numbers," Madeline said, her voice echoing with lethal authority. "I am a forensic accountant. I tracked the $2 million he stole from the Volkov syndicate and deposited into your Bank of Ireland offshore shell company. And 10 minutes ago, while sitting in Mr. Volkov's penthouse, I drained it. Your accounts are at zero, Declan. You can't even pay the men standing behind you." A murmur of unease rippled through the Irish thugs. Loyalty was expensive, and Madeline had just announced their paychecks had bounced. "You little bitch," Declan snarled, raising his weapon toward Madeline. He never got the shot off. Alexei's hand moved with a terrifying fluid speed. 2 silenced shots coughed in the damp air. The first bullet shattered Declan's knee. The second took him in the right shoulder. Declan screamed, dropping the revolver and collapsing to the asphalt. Hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Yuri and Ivan laid down a suppressing wall of lead, forcing the Irish thugs into cover behind their vans. Alexei grabbed Madeline, pulling her behind the reinforced steel of the Escalade's engine block. "Stay down," he ordered over the deafening roar of automatic weapons. But the fight was over before it truly began. Murphy's men, demoralized by the news of their empty bank accounts and outgunned by the disciplined militaristic precision of the Volkov enforcers, broke. 2 vans peeled away, tires screaming, abandoning their bleeding boss on the docks. Silence fell over Pier 40, broken only by the lapping of the river and Declan Murphy's agonizing groans. Jonathan Foster was still kneeling on the ground, untouched by the crossfire, weeping openly into his bound hands. Alexei reloaded his weapon methodically. He walked over to Declan, looking down at the ruined mob boss with absolute disgust. He didn't waste words. He simply raised his gun and fired once. The Irish war was over. Alexei turned his attention to Jonathan. The accountant looked up, his face pale with terror. "Alexei, please. I can make it right. I can work for you again. Maddie, tell him. Tell him I'm useful." Madeline stepped out from behind the SUV. She walked slowly toward her father. She looked down at him, evaluating him the way one evaluates a bad investment. "You traded me for $2 million, Madeline said softly. "You left me to the cartel. I was going to come back for you." Jonathan pleaded, sobbing. "I just needed time." "Time is up," Madeline said. She turned her back on him and looked at Alexei. "I don't care what you do with him. Just keep him away from me." Alexei nodded. He gestured to Ivan. "Put him in the trunk. We will let the authorities find him. A man with his financial history will spend the rest of his life in a federal supermax." Jonathan screamed as Ivan dragged him away, but Madeline didn't look back. She walked toward the edge of the pier, looking out at the dark, churning water of the Hudson. The cold wind whipped her hair around her face. She had crossed a line tonight, burning the bridge to her old life completely. She heard the soft crunch of heavy boots on asphalt behind her. Alexei stood beside her, the collar of his coat turned up against the wind. "It is done," Alexei said quietly. "Your debt is paid. Your enemies are broken." Madeline looked at him. The blood on his cuff, the lethal grace of his movements, the absolute power he wielded it terrified her, but it also called to a darkness within her she had tried to suppress her entire life. "What now, Alexei?" she asked. Alexei reached out, his gloved hand gently brushing a damp lock of hair from her cheek. It was an intimate, startling gesture from a man composed of ice and steel. "Now," Alexei murmured, his blue eyes holding hers with a possessive, burning intensity. "Now you stop serving the world, Madeline. You let the world serve you. You belong with me, at the top of the empire." Madeline looked at the city's skyline, glittering like diamonds against the black sky. She was done running. She was done hiding. "Then let's go home," Madeline said. Alexei smiled in the dark. He offered her his arm, and together, the mob boss and his new architect walked away from the blood-stained docks, stepping into the shadows to rule the city. What a wild ride from a high-end restaurant to the ruthless criminal underworld. If you love this intense, twist-filled mafia romance drama about Madeline taking control of her destiny and outsmarting 2 dangerous syndicates, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets us know you want more dark, thrilling stories like this one. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a brilliant, strong female lead and a ruthless, protective mafia boss. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming audio dramas, intense thrillers, and immersive storytelling experiences. Drop a comment below. Did you expect that massive twist with her father? What was your favorite moment between Alexei and Madeline? Let us know, and we'll see you in the next story.